My name is Michael. I never believed in legends or mystical stories. Life was simple: work, a few buddies, and looking for entertainment that always ended with strange adventures alongside my friend Jack. But one night changed everything. If I could turn back time, I would do anything to avoid getting into that damned car. But now, it's too late to fix it. It happened a few months ago. Jack and I were sitting in his garage, which had been turned into a chaotic headquarters for our silly escapades. An empty whiskey bottle lay on the table, and we were planning what to do next. That's when Jack spoke up. "Michael, have you heard about the cursed road in Missouri?" His grin was like that of a cat that caught a mouse. "No. And I'd rather not hear about it," I grumbled, downing the last drop from the bottle. "Let me explain. It's a road the locals tell scary stories about. People disappear there without a trace. And those who return talk about the black dog. Do you know what they say about it?" "What?" I asked, feigning indifference. "It's like an ominous spirit. A dog that always foretells death. If you see it, it means someone nearby is going to die." I frowned. "And you seriously want to go there? This doesn't even sound like your usual nonsense." "Why not? Think about how cool it would be to see if it's true. We'll record a video, capture everything on camera. It'll be our legend." Jack had always been obsessed with risk. His ideas always led to trouble, yet I agreed every time. He knew how to persuade me. This time was no different, even though my gut screamed that this was a bad idea. But I ignored that voice, and it was my biggest mistake. We set off the following night. Jack brought everything he thought might come in handy: a camera, a few powerful flashlights, even an old GPS device that looked more like a museum piece than a modern gadget. Always the practical one, I packed bottles of water, a couple of sandwiches, and a power bank for my phone. Even if there was no signal out there, I wanted at least some assurance that this wouldn't turn into our final journey. We left at 10 o'clock at night, when the city was almost asleep. The road was long and quiet, as it always is before something bad happens. At first, everything seemed normal, familiar suburbs with neat rows of houses. But with each mile, the scenery began to change. The road narrowed, and the trees started to loom over us like a dark green curtain. It felt as if even the moon was afraid to shine on this place. "Looks like we're driving into the set of some horror movie," I muttered, keeping my eyes glued to the window. "That's what makes it exciting," Jack replied, his voice brimming with anticipation. We made a stop at an old gas station in the middle of nowhere to stock up. Inside, we were greeted by an elderly woman who reminded me of those characters in movies who always warn the protagonists, but no one ever listens to them. "Where are you two headed so late?" she asked, squinting as we placed a few bags of chips and some batteries on the counter. "Just out for a drive," Jack replied with a casual smile, trying to appear friendly. "You're not headed to the cursed road, are you?" Her voice darkened, and her gaze grew as sharp as a blade. Jack's grin widened. "And what if we are?" The woman leaned over the counter, her eyes gleaming like those of a predatory bird. "Don't do it. There's nothing there but trouble. You'll only bring misfortune upon yourselves." For a moment, I saw a flicker of doubt in Jack's eyes, but he quickly suppressed it. He was always the one to laugh in the face of danger. "Thanks for your concern, ma'am," he said, winking. "But we're not the type to be scared of shadows." She didn't respond. She just shook her head as if she already knew how it would all end. Her gaze followed us all the way to the door, and I felt a cold knot of unease settle in my chest. But I stayed silent. We found the entrance to the cursed road around midnight. A rusty sign hanging on old metal posts was barely legible. It read, "Enter at your own risk." "Now this," Jack said, grinning as though he was already anticipating something exciting. "This is a real place for adventure." He pulled out his camera and started filming everything around us. We drove onto the road. At first, everything seemed fairly ordinary. A narrow strip of asphalt cutting through the trees, cracks and potholes that we occasionally had to swerve around. But with every passing meter, every moment, something strange seemed to build. The air felt heavier, thicker, like a sticky fog. I could feel a chill creeping in through the windows, even though the car's heater was on. "Don't you think it's a little too quiet?" I asked, peering into the darkness outside the window. Jack turned off the music, which had been playing faintly, and listened intently. The silence was unnatural. No birds, no crickets, not even the whisper of the wind. The car engine sounded almost muted, apart from the faint rumble of the tires against the asphalt. "It's just your nerves, Michael," Jack replied, but I noticed his fingers tightening on the steering wheel. He was trying to play it cool, but I knew him well enough to see how this eerie atmosphere was starting to wear on him. And then we heard it. A growl. Low, drawn out, almost animal-like. It seemed to come from the woods, maybe just a few feet away, or perhaps from somewhere deeper in the shadows ahead. My entire body tensed, and I realized my mouth had gone dry. "What was that?" I blurted out, instinctively gripping Jack's shoulder. "Probably just a wolf," he replied, but his voice was barely above a whisper. Jack was never one to admit fear, but this time his words sounded hollow. We kept driving, though the tension in the car had become almost unbearable. The growl had faded, but the sense of danger lingered. My thoughts raced, and my heart was pounding so loudly it felt like its beat was filling the entire car. "Maybe we should turn back?" I tried to sound calm, but my hand was already resting on the door handle, ready to open it at any moment. Jack just gave a small nod, more to himself than to me, and pressed harder on the gas. But what we didn't know was that ahead of us lay far more than just a growl. A few minutes later, the car suddenly stalled. Everything, engine, headlights, even the dashboard, shut off, plunging us into thick, absolute darkness. It felt as if the entire world around us had frozen. "What the hell?" Jack exclaimed, turning the ignition key repeatedly. The starter was silent, as if we had fallen into some void where technology simply ceased to function. "Maybe the battery's dead?" I suggested weakly, though deep down, I already knew this wasn't a mechanical problem. "Bullshit. I checked everything before the trip. The car was in perfect condition." Jack snapped, his voice edged with a sharpness that only came out when he was scared but refused to show it. To my utter horror, he opened the door and stepped outside. A cold night wind swept into the cabin, and a shiver ran down my spine. "Jack, don't! Are you out of your mind?" I yelled, but the door slammed shut behind him. The darkness was so dense, I could barely see his figure. He stood next to the car, lighting his way with a flashlight he pulled from his pocket. "I'm just going to take a look. Maybe it's something with the wiring," he said, his voice distant, as if he didn't fully believe his own words. I couldn't bring myself to follow. Something about this place felt so profoundly wrong that my body refused to move. I clung to the seat, feeling my fear grow into full-blown paranoia. Jack leaned over the hood, his flashlight flickering in the darkness. But then I saw it. Behind him, among the trees, something moved. A shadow. Massive, predatory, with eyes that gleamed for a moment like two fiery embers. "Jack, get back in the car! Now!" I shouted, my voice breaking with panic. "What is it?" He jerked his head up, but it was already too late. The shadow shifted, and the sound that followed, a deep, guttural growl, rumbled through the silence like something straight from the depths of hell. "Get in the car, damn it!" I screamed, grabbing the door handle, ready to jump out if I had to. But I didn't get the chance. The shadow stepped forward, and I saw it in all its terrifying clarity. A massive black dog, its fur seeming to absorb the faint light, its glowing red eyes piercing as if they could see straight into my soul. Jack stood frozen in place, like a statue. When Jack stepped out of the car, the darkness around him became almost tangible. It wrapped everything like a thick layer of smoke, and even the beam of his flashlight seemed faint and muffled. I stayed in the car, nervously staring into the night, where the flicker of his flashlight was the only thing separating me from the impenetrable void. "Well, what do you see?" I finally called out, unable to bear the tension. "Nothing. Everything looks fine," Jack replied, though his voice lacked the confidence he was trying to project. He leaned closer to the hood, his flashlight sweeping across the engine, and I could hear him muttering something under his breath. I pulled out my phone. As expected, there was no signal. It felt as though we were trapped in a place disconnected from the ordinary world. Drumming my fingers on the seat, I could feel my nerves stretched thin, like taut strings. Something was wrong here. It was in the air, in the cold breath of the wind that carried an eerie stillness. And then I heard it. A low, guttural growl, emanating from somewhere deep in the trees behind us. It was a sound that made my blood run cold. "Jack, did you hear that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" His response was immediate, but there was a hint of unease in his tone. The growl came again, louder this time, closer, and I knew it wasn't just my imagination. I whipped around to look in the rearview mirror, but all I could see was the dark fog swallowing everything around us. "Jack, that's not a wolf," I whispered, gripping the seat so tightly that my fingers turned white. Jack straightened up, wiping his hands on his pants, and began to slowly glance around. "You think I like this? There's something off here," he admitted, his words firm, though his movements betrayed his unease. And then it happened. At first, I only saw movement, something big and dark darting between the trees behind us. It nearly dissolved into the mist, but its red eyes stood out, burning like two bloody embers. "Jack! Get back in the car, now!" I shouted, but instead of hurrying back, he froze, as if rooted to the ground. The growl turned into a deep, rolling roar, and the figure in the shadows stepped forward. It was a dog, a massive, black creature with fur that seemed to absorb the light, as if the night itself had come alive. Its mouth hung open, revealing rows of long, sharp teeth, and its crimson eyes bore straight into us. "Jack!" I screamed again, but he didn't move, only stared at the creature, as though mesmerized. Jack's flashlight suddenly went out, plunging him into complete darkness. He froze, as if paralyzed, standing by the car. I could see his head slowly turn to the left, toward the woods, and his body stiffened, like a statue. "Jack, what is it?" I shouted through the glass, but he didn't respond, as though he couldn't hear me. Then I saw it. At first, it was just a blurry silhouette emerging from the fog. A large black figure, almost invisible against the darkness, as if the night itself had taken shape. But it was the eyes that terrified me the most. Two blazing red embers that pierced through me even from a distance. They didn't just stare, they seemed to read my thoughts, burning away every ounce of courage I had. "Jack, for God's sake, get in the car!" I screamed, but my voice felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive silence of this place. Jack stepped back once, then again, his movements slow, as if his legs were weighed down by invisible chains. And then, the creature moved. Slowly, almost gracefully, it stepped out of the fog, revealing its horrific form. It was a dog, or rather, something that might have once been a dog. Its size was unreal, towering nearly to the height of a man's shoulders. Its fur was so black it seemed to consume what little light there was, and its mouth parted just enough to reveal teeth, sharp as daggers, gleaming faintly in the darkness. "Unlock the door, Michael!" Jack yelled, bolting toward the car. He yanked at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. I fumbled to unlock it, but my fingers trembled so violently that I could barely press the button. The dog stopped just a few meters from Jack. Its eyes still burned, but now there was something more in them than rage. There was intelligence. It no longer growled, but its silence was even more terrifying. It hung in the air, pressing on my chest like the stillness before death. Suddenly, Jack's flashlight flickered back on, briefly illuminating the dog's face. In that split second, I saw its teeth, gleaming, unnaturally sharp, glinting in the darkness as if they were waiting to sink into flesh. "Jack, hurry! Get in the car, damn it!" I shouted, trying to stifle the rising panic in my voice. But it was already too late. I finally managed to unlock the door, but Jack was already gone. It all happened in the blink of an eye. His scream tore through the darkness, echoing among the trees, and then stopped as abruptly as it had started. All I heard next was the dull thud of heavy paws disappearing into the forest. leaving behind a suffocating silence. "Jack!" I yelled, stumbling out of the car. The cold air stung my face, but I didn't care. I rushed around, desperately searching for any sign of him. The forest responded with nothing but fog and that oppressive silence, unnatural and deeply unsettling. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and began scanning the ground around me. Its faint beam barely pierced the thick fog, but I pressed on, circling the car and directing the light to the spot where I had last seen Jack. Every step I took seemed deafeningly loud, as if the darkness itself was waiting for me to make a mistake. The ground was cold and damp, each breath filling my lungs with clammy air. Then I saw them. Tracks, large, deep prints left by paws so massive they seemed grotesquely oversized, even for the largest of dogs. I crouched down and touched the ground. It was soft and slick, as though it had been freshly disturbed. Something big had passed through here, leaving behind a trail of chaos. Some of the tracks disappeared under branches and leaves, but they all led into the forest. Then I noticed something that made me freeze. The earth was pressed down and damp in a way that suggested something heavy had been dragged across it. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Jack!" I called again, my voice trembling as I tried to drown out the rising panic within me. There was no response. Only the distant sounds of the forest, though they didn't feel like the sounds of nature. They were echoes of something older, darker. I stood up and slowly turned, sweeping the phone's light around me. The feeling of being watched was so intense that I nearly dropped the phone. Something was out there, hiding in the darkness. And I knew this wasn't going to end well. I heard it again, the same low growl, but now it came from all around me. It echoed in the fog, blending with the rustling leaves and the crack of twigs. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint the source, but I saw nothing. The fog seemed alive, closing in tighter and growing thicker with every passing second. And then I saw them. At first, just one pair of eyes, those same red, burning lights that pierced straight into my soul. Then another. And another. The red eyes filled the fog, flickering here and there, as though hunting me. I could no longer tell if it was the same dog or if there were many of them. They moved in the shadows, circling like wolves stalking their prey. I had no time to think. I bolted forward, not knowing where I was running. My feet slipped on the wet grass, the fog clawing at my lungs and turning every breath into a struggle. The growls followed me, growing louder. It felt like these creatures weren't just chasing me, they were toying with me. Every sound was a taunt, every step a deliberate move in some horrifying game. Then, through the thick fog, I saw it. A light. Faint and flickering ahead, but enough to ignite a spark of hope. I sprinted toward it, stumbling and falling but refusing to stop. When I finally reached it, I saw an old lamppost, its light barely hanging on, surrounded by a web of rusted cracks. Next to it was an abandoned building, half collapsed, with shattered windows and peeling paint. Without a second thought, I dashed inside, slamming the door shut behind me with such force that it nearly came off its hinges. I pressed my back against the cold wall, gasping for air. My heart pounded so hard that it drowned out almost every other sound. The building was dark, but it was a different kind of darkness, less hostile than the one waiting outside. For a few seconds there was silence. It seemed as though they had stopped. But I knew better. This wasn't a victory. It was just a pause before the next move. Inside, it was dark and damp, the air thick with the smell of mildew and rot. It looked like an old warehouse or workshop, long abandoned and stripped of purpose. Rusty tools, broken wooden crates, and piles of debris littered the floor. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, as if no one had set foot there for decades. I moved deeper inside, scanning the dimness for anything that could serve as a weapon or help me survive. The light from my phone barely pierced the gloom, but it was enough to illuminate an old wooden table in the center of the room. On it lay a yellowed newspaper. I picked it up, and my chest tightened. The front page carried a story about the disappearances on the Black Road. The headline screamed in bold letters, "Tragic disappearances on the cursed road." Below it were photos of several young people staring back at me with frozen, lifeless smiles. I couldn't tear my eyes away from their faces. They looked so real, as if they had been alive just yesterday. "Jack," I whispered, feeling a chill seep into my skin. He could be next. Or maybe he already was. My mind was reeling when I heard it, a creak behind me. The sound was faint, but in the silence of the building, it rang out like thunder. Cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I froze, straining to determine if it was just my imagination. I turned slowly, gripping a rusty key I'd found on the floor. My breathing was shallow and ragged, my heart pounding like a drum. The door I had slammed shut was still there, still closed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. Unseen, silent, but undeniably present. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to infuse my voice with confidence, but it cracked into a rasp. My echo came back to me, but there was no reply. Only silence. I stepped backward then again. The shadow on the wall cast by my phone's light seemed larger than it should have been. And then I felt it, a faint draft of cold air. It brushed past me as if something invisible had just walked by. A wave of terror gripped me, freezing me in place. I froze, as if nailed to the floor. The silence that filled the building was so complete that I could almost hear the pounding of my own heart. But within that silence, I caught another sound, faint, like someone's cautious step on an old, creaking floor. It came from the very edge of my vision. "Who's there?" I shouted, though my voice trembled and broke. No answer. Only a faint rustle, closer now, almost at my side. I glanced at my phone, fumbling to turn it on and light the space again. But the screen stayed black. The battery, which had shown 30% just moments ago, was now dead. Darkness wrapped around me like grasping fingers, and the air grew thicker, heavier, as though I was submerged underwater. My breaths came fast and shallow, panic overtaking me. I stepped back, toward the door, the only way out. But as I moved, a loud creak sounded behind me, so sharp and sudden that I barely stifled a scream. I whipped around, nearly dropping the key still clutched in my hand. Where there had been only darkness moments ago, now stood a figure. Its outline was hazy, blurred by the thick fog that seemed alive, silently creeping into the room. It was tall, unnaturally still, and more imposing than any human could be. But what terrified me most were its eyes. The same red eyes I had seen before, burning bright as if they had emerged from the depths of hell, stared directly at me. They glowed, two fiery orbs that seemed to pry into my deepest fears. My body refused to obey. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't even look away. Those eyes held me captive, and within them was something inhuman, malevolent. Something that seemed to know everything about me. "What do you want?" I whispered, not even sure if I was addressing the figure or the oppressive silence around me. The figure remained motionless. Then I heard it, the low, guttural growl. It reverberated through the entire building, vibrating through the walls, the floor, and even the air. It shook me to my very core, as though the growl was not just a sound but a force. And then, the figure began to move. Slowly, step by step, it advanced toward me. I took a step back, clutching the rusty key in my hand so tightly that my fingers turned white. It was a pitiful weapon against the monstrosity before me. The dog took another step forward. Its paws were enormous, each movement deliberate and confident, like a predator certain of its victory. It was not of this world. There was something so alien and wrong about its presence that every instinct in my body screamed at me to run, but my legs felt rooted to the floor. Finally, I forced myself to move and darted toward the door, desperately trying to open it. My hands frantically pulled at the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. It was locked, as if someone or something had sealed it from the outside. I yanked and pounded on it with my fists, but it remained immovable. Behind me, the growling grew louder, filling the air with an overwhelming, oppressive sound. I glanced back. The dog was only a few steps away now. Its eyes burned like two molten coals, staring into me with an intensity that seemed endless. Thick black liquid, like oil, or something even more vile, dripped slowly from its open jaws. This was no animal. It was something that had no right to exist in our world. In panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I turned to the window beside me and slammed my elbow into it with all my strength. The glass shattered into shards, and sharp edges sliced into my arms. I felt hot liquid running down my skin but ignored it. There was no pain. There was only the terror driving me to keep moving. I scrambled through the window, the jagged shards tearing at my clothes and flesh, but it didn't matter. Once I was outside, I didn't dare look back. I knew it was there. The growling was now the soundtrack of my flight, propelling my legs to move faster than they ever had before. I ran, not thinking, not feeling anything but the primal urge to survive. My breaths were ragged, the cold air cutting into my lungs. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew that stopping meant the end. As I burst out of the building, the fog grew so dense it felt as though it was wrapping around me, cutting off any possible escape. I looked around, but everything looked the same, trees looming on all sides, and an impenetrable grayness that turned the world into a labyrinth. The road was gone. The forest had closed in around me, trapping me in its grip. "Jack!" I yelled, my voice slicing through the thick silence, but there was no reply. Only the faint echo that quickly faded, as if the fog had swallowed it whole. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps growing closer behind me. My body froze, my heart skipped a beat. Something inside me screamed, "Don't look! If you see it again, you won't escape!" I took a few hesitant steps forward, but the fear overwhelmed me, and I broke into a run. My feet slipped on the damp ground, branches snagged at my clothes, and roots seemed to spring up to trip me. I could hear the growling behind me, growing louder and closer, as if the monstrous thing was toying with me, savoring my terror. Then I heard something else. A voice. Quiet, barely audible, but unmistakable. At first, it was like a whisper, drifting from somewhere deep within the fog. "Michael! Michael!" I froze. It was Jack's voice. It sounded so close, as if he were right there with me. I skidded to a halt, my feet sinking into the soft earth. "Jack!" I shouted, staring into the swirling fog ahead of me, which twisted and coiled like it was alive. "Where are you? Answer me!" I waited, my breath ragged, my chest aching from the tension. Then it happened. Instead of a response, I heard laughter. It wasn't ordinary laughter. It was distorted, grotesque, as though something was attempting to mimic human laughter but didn't quite understand how. It was a twisted mockery of human joy, a chilling parody that made my legs tremble. "Jack?" I shouted again, my voice cracking. But now, the fog around me began to stir, as if something massive and unseen was moving within it. The laughter didn't stop. It grew louder, filling the air, pressing into my ears, reverberating inside my skull. And that's when I realized, this wasn't Jack. It was something else. Something that was only pretending to be him. I saw something ahead. In the thick fog, a faint light flickered, weak, but bright enough to spark a glimmer of hope. A flashlight. It must be Jack. Without thinking, I pushed forward, tearing through branches and wet grass. But as I got closer, the hope vanished as quickly as it had come. Hanging from the branch of a tree was only his jacket. It was torn and dirted, as if it had been dragged across the ground. Beneath it lay the camera we had brought to capture our evidence. It was scratched, broken, the lens shattered as though someone had stomped on it with brutal force. "Jack! Are you here?" I shouted, but the forest answered me only with silence. My voice cracked, but I kept calling, desperate for a reply. Instead, all I heard was the hollow echo of my own despair. And then it happened. The air around me grew cold. Not the natural chill of the night, but something far more sinister. It seeped into my skin, squeezing my chest with a fear so primal it felt like my heart was being crushed. I turned my head, and terror took hold of me. He was there. The black dog, the same one that had been hunting me this entire time. Its eyes burned with red fire, and it didn't move. It just stood there, completely still, as if waiting. But that wasn't all. Behind it, within the fog, other shapes began to emerge. They materialized from the dense gray like shadows come to life. There were many, 10, 20, maybe more. And all of them had those same burning red eyes. My heart pounded wildly, as though it was trying to escape from my chest. I stood frozen, unable to move, as though their gaze had shattered my will. These creatures were not alive. There was nothing earthly about them. They were something else, something that had no place in our world. I realized this was the end. My body refused to respond, my legs felt as heavy as lead. One thought spiraled through my mind: I wouldn't make it out of here. These creatures weren't just hunters. They were death itself, come to claim me. Suddenly, I heard a sound. Faint and distant, but it sliced through the oppressive silence like a lifeline. It was the hum of an engine. My heart leapt for a moment, and I pushed myself forward, ignoring the pain in my legs, torn by branches, and my arms slick with blood from the shattered glass. The growling behind me grew louder, but I didn't dare stop. Ahead, through the fog, I saw two beams of light, headlights. It was an old truck, moving slowly along the road. My body surged with adrenaline, and I gathered all my remaining strength, running onto the road and waving my arms. "Stop! Help!" I screamed, barely able to keep myself upright. The truck came to a halt. Behind the wheel sat an older man with a thick gray beard and deep lines etched into his weathered face. He rolled down the window, his eyes filled with suspicion and wariness as they scanned me. "What are you doing out here, boy?" he asked in a rough, gravelly voice. I gasped for air, trying to form words. "Help me! There's something out there! The black dog! They're after me!" The words spilled out, tangled with panic and desperation. The man stared at me, then glanced at the forest behind me. His eyes narrowed, and his face grew grave. He knew. I could see it in his expression. He understood exactly what I was talking about. "Get in the truck." "No," he ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. I didn't hesitate. I yanked the door open, practically falling inside, and slammed it shut behind me. The truck growled as the man stepped on the gas, and we sped away, leaving the forest and whatever was chasing me behind. But even inside the cab, I could still hear the growling in my mind, feel the burning red eyes boring into my back. "You're lucky I was here," the man muttered, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. His voice carried a weight of dread. "This road isn't meant for people like you." I said nothing. I just sat there, trembling, staring into the rearview mirror, expecting to see their shapes emerging from the fog at any moment. I climbed into the truck, slamming the door shut, and the man immediately hit the gas. The truck lurched forward, leaving the forest and the horrors hidden within it behind. I sat there, breathing heavily, staring out the window. I wanted to believe it was over, that we'd left them behind in the darkness. But as we drove further down the road, I saw them. Silhouettes lined the roadside. Tall and motionless, they looked like shadows brought to life. There were so many of them, far more than I'd seen before. All of them were facing us. Their glowing red eyes pierced through the fog, like smoldering embers, and I felt my heart stop. This wasn't an escape, I knew that. They were watching, observing, and there was something in their gaze that promised it wasn't over. The driver noticed where I was looking and sighed heavily. "You're lucky, kid, that you got out of there," he said, his eyes fixed firmly on the road. His voice was gravelly, but it carried an eerie certainty, as if he'd seen this before. I didn't reply. I couldn't. My throat was dry, and my thoughts were a tangled mess. I wanted to believe it was over, but those eyes, they were still watching. "Not everyone gets that kind of luck," the driver continued. His words sounded more like a warning than reassurance. He spoke calmly, but there was an undercurrent of fear in his tone. "But remember this, kid, the black dog always comes back. Always." I glanced back, but the fog had swallowed everything. The figures were no longer visible, but I knew they were still there. They hadn't disappeared. And they would be waiting. Several months have passed. I returned home. but life has never been the same. My house, once quiet and comforting, now feels like a trap, locked in an endless cycle of fear. The police questioned me for hours, but in the end, they just shook their heads, noting that I was probably suffering from shock or making up stories. Mark was never found. His name disappeared from the reports, just like he himself vanished, as if he had never existed. I've tried to return to a normal life, but the shadows of that horror continue to haunt me. I don't go outside at night anymore. Even the thought of the dark makes my hands tremble and my heart race. But even within the walls of my own home, I don't feel safe. Every night, when the silence settles, I see them. Red eyes glowing in the darkness now appear outside my window. They don't move, they just watch. Their gaze pierces through me, a reminder that I didn't escape them. I've only bought myself a little time. Sometimes, I hear the growling. It's faint but unmistakable. It echoes even in complete silence, even when I try to convince myself it's just my imagination. But I know better. It's not my imagination. They're real. I don't sleep anymore. I sit by the window, clutching a kitchen knife or some other object that could serve as a weapon, though deep down I know it's useless. They're not afraid of metal, not afraid of people. They fear only one thing: when you start to understand that your fate is already sealed. I know they'll come for me. It's only a matter of time. And when they do, I won't be able to run.